He had a shovel. He had a flag planted in soil that didn't belong to him. He had a mind full of blueprints in a world that had never seen a blueprint. And he had absolutely no business being here. Until one night, without warning, without ceremony, the world he knew vanished, and a different world swallowed him whole. This is the story of Lloyd Frontera, the man with the shovel, the boy who fell into the wrong story and decided to rewrite it anyway. It began the way most disasters do, quietly. A young man lying on cold ground, staring at something glowing above him. Not the stars, a notification. Congratulations, it read. He did not feel congratulated. He felt cold. He felt the dirt against his cheek, and he felt, with growing certainty, that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The system had chosen him, not for glory, not for war, for a wish. And the wish had deposited him, body, soul, and modern engineering degree, into a crumbling noble estate at the edge of a fantasy kingdom. He lay there a long moment, pondering his options. Then he got up, because that was the only thing left to do. The body he'd inherited had a name. Lloyd Frontera, son of a baron, heir to a debt-riddled estate, known in the story this world was supposed to follow as a villain, a minor one, the kind who gets written off in Chapter 3. But the man now wearing that name had read this story. He knew exactly how it ended for Lloyd Frontera, and he had absolutely no intention of letting that happen. The estate itself was a ruin. Broken furniture, cracked walls, a bull skull hung where a portrait should have been. The kind of decay that doesn't happen overnight. The kind that accumulates across years of bad decisions and worse luck, and presiding over all of it, his father. A man whose face carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had stopped believing things could improve. There was also a swordsman, Javier, blue-haired, sword-sharp, watching Lloyd with the wariness of a man who had already decided the person in front of him was trouble. He wasn't wrong, but not in the way he expected. Lloyd's first priority was simple: survive. His second priority was equally simple: make money. His third priority, the one he hadn't told anyone about yet, was considerably more ambitious: build something. Something that would matter. The system that had dragged him here had at least offered a consolation prize, an RP system. Points earned by gaining the approval of the people around him, points that could be spent on skills. He stared at his current total, 0. He stared at Javier's approval rating of him, also not encouraging. He would have to earn it, all of it. The village detached to the Frontera estate was the kind of place that had given up. Small, dusty, the kind of dusty that gets into your teeth. The people moved slowly, not from leisure, but from a lack of reason to hurry. Lloyd walked among them and saw something nobody else seemed to see. Potential. Raw, untapped, waiting. He had spent his previous life studying civil engineering. He had worked construction sites. He had hauled bricks and read blueprints and argued with project managers. And now, looking at this crumbling estate and these exhausted people, he felt something ignite behind his eyes. This wasn't a dead end. This was a blank page. His first move was the pub, a rotting, debt-soaked tavern whose owner had borrowed money from the Frontera family and never paid it back. Lloyd didn't come to collect. He came with a contract. The bald owner sweated through every clause. He had the look of a man waiting for the trap to spring. But there was no trap. Just a deal, a renovation, a bathhouse, steam and warmth, and something the village hadn't had in years: comfort. The man with the shovel got to work. He dug, he hauled, he built timber frames with hands that had never held a noble sword. Javier watched all of this with an expression caught between contempt and confusion. This was not how nobles behaved. Nobles did not sweat. Nobles did not swing axes. Nobles certainly did not collapse face first in the dirt and then get up grinning. And yet, the house went up, slowly, imperfectly, with the particular stubbornness of someone who refuses to acknowledge the word impossible. It went up. When the elderly couple from the village first stepped into the steam room, they wept. Not from pain, from relief. The old man reached out with trembling hands, overwhelmed by something as simple as warmth. Lloyd watched from the doorway. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The system registered the moment before he did. Approval up, RP gained. He smiled, not the smile of a man who had just made money. The smile of a man who had just proven something to himself. But the approval of 2 elderly villagers was not going to save the Frontera estate. The debt was real. The moneylenders were real. 2 of them arrived at the manor with the particular air of men who expected to leave with something. Lloyd's father sat at the head of a long dining table, eating dinner with the strained calm of someone who had made peace with catastrophe. The room felt like a held breath. Lloyd watched from the doorway. He had been watching from doorways his entire time in this body. Learning, calculating, waiting for the right moment to act. The RP system had given him something beyond approval points. It had given him skills. Real ones. Architectural sight. The ability to look at a patch of land and truly see what it could become. He used it now, staring at the estate grounds. And what he saw made him grin in the dark like something dangerous. The moneylenders left with a contract they hadn't expected to sign. Lloyd had walked into that negotiation with a pouch of coins and a rolled document. He had walked out with something worth considerably more. Time. Breathing room. The boy they called a villain had just outmaneuvered men twice his age, and nobody had seen it coming. There was, however, a complication. His name was Neumann, senior knight of the Frontera estate. A man with a mustache like a declaration of war and eyes that had decided Lloyd was a problem the moment Lloyd had arrived. Neumann watched the construction. He watched the digging. He watched Lloyd drag laborers through exercises that looked nothing like noble training, and everything like something from another world entirely. And he didn't like any of it. The confrontation was inevitable. Neumann stepped into the training yard with a sword. Lloyd stepped in with a shovel. The crowd that gathered had come to watch a beating. They had not come to watch a philosophy, but that was what they got. Neumann attacked with the fury of a man who had been training for decades. Lloyd did not try to match him. He redirected. He evaded. He used the shovel not as a weapon but as a lever, turning the knight's own momentum against him. The crowd went quiet. Neumann swung again and again. Each time, Lloyd moved just enough, just barely, with the precise, infuriating calm of someone who had already calculated the outcome. Then the old knight drew on his mana. Blue energy crackled along the sword's edge. The crowd stepped back. Even Javier's hand moved toward his hilt. And Lloyd, the man with the shovel, the boy who fell into the wrong story, grinned. He had been waiting for this. The shovel came down. Neumann hit the ground. The crowd didn't cheer. They stared. The way people stare when something impossible has just happened in front of them. The knight lay in the dust, looking at the sky with the particular expression of a man whose entire understanding of the world has just been revised. Lloyd stood over him. Not triumphant, tired, but undefeated. The system registered that too. Approval up, RP gained. He would not forget this. The night was a different matter. Under a full moon, with the owls calling and the estate quiet, Lloyd sat with his thoughts. He had a system. He had skills. He had a shovel and a head full of engineering. What he needed was a companion. Something the system called a summoned creature. He pressed the button. The magic circle ignited. Gears turned within it, green and luminous and grinding with ancient energy. Lloyd leaned forward, expecting something magnificent, a dragon perhaps, a unicorn, something worthy of legend. What he got was a hamster, fluffy, round, absolutely delighted with itself. Lloyd stared at it. The hamster stared back. Then it ate a branch. Enthusiastically, he named it Peepodong. Because of course he did. What Peepodong lacked in majesty, it made up for in enthusiasm. The creature lunged for seeds with a ferocity that suggested it had forgotten it was small. It devoured everything offered to it. It developed skills. Digging, packing dirt, stuffing its cheeks with an improbable quantity of material. Lloyd watched all of this with the slow dawning expression of a man who had just realized that the universe had not, in fact, given him a useless creature. It had given him a construction worker, a very small, very fluffy, very enthusiastic construction worker. He clenched his fist in the dark. Something was beginning to take shape. The next morning, Lloyd assembled his workforce. Laborers with shovels, standing in the pale morning light. Uncertain men who had spent their lives being told what they couldn't do. Lloyd looked at them the way an engineer looks at raw material, with absolute confidence in what they could become. He pointed at the ground. They dug. He pointed at the timber. They built. He pointed at Podong. The hamster charged forward with terrifying enthusiasm, kicking up a wall of dust. The laborers stared. Lloyd shrugged. He had learned to stop questioning the hamster. But the estate's problems were not merely financial. They were also political. His father had enemies. Men with power and patience and the specific cruelty of those who have been waiting a long time to collect. Neumann, despite his defeat, was among them. He walked through the grand hall with a plan forming behind his eyes. Something that did not include Lloyd surviving to adulthood. Lloyd knew. He had always known. That was the weight of reading the story before living it. You know where the knives are. You just have to make sure you're not standing where they land. He trained Javier, not with swords, with theory, with mana manipulation techniques that the young swordsman had never encountered in any training hall. Javier listened with the expression of someone who is deeply skeptical but cannot argue with the results. The results were undeniable. Blue energy pooled in the young swordsman's chest, steadier than before. Stronger, Javier's approval rating shifted, just slightly, but enough. Years later, he would understand what Lloyd had given him that night. Not just technique, a foundation. The town beyond the estate had its own problems. A border settlement, small and rough-edged, sitting at the intersection of too many dangers. Lloyd arrived with his shovel on his shoulder and his eyes already calculating. The inn sign swayed in the evening air. Inside, things were already complicated. A green-haired young man sat at a candlelit table clutching his head. Across from him, a scarred man in a dark cloak radiated the particular menace of someone who has nothing left to lose. Lloyd kicked the door open, not heroically, practically. He walked into the middle of someone else's crisis the way the man with the shovel always walked into things, with a plan already forming. The scarred man was dangerous, genuinely deeply dangerous. Dark energy coiled around him like something alive. Javier arrived in time to see the worst of it. Pink magic erupted through the street, the kind of magic that doesn't care about walls. Javier fought, hard, with everything the training had given him. The scarred man didn't fall easily. He absorbed strikes that should have ended the fight. He kept moving, kept pressing. The green-haired young man, the one who had been at the table, was screaming somewhere in the chaos. Lloyd watched from the shadows and made the calculation that only the man with the shovel would make. He didn't fight the scarred man. He waited for the opening, and when it came, he moved. What followed was not elegant. The green-haired man, Dwayne, as he would introduce himself later, trembling over a contract, was bound and seated across from Lloyd in a candlelit room. Lloyd poured tea. He smiled. He slid a contract across the table. The tied-up man stared at it with the expression of someone who cannot decide if they are being saved or sold. He signed it, because the alternative was considerably worse. The boy who fell into the wrong story had just acquired a new asset. Something was coming. Lloyd could feel it in the way the pale-haired noble beside him had gone quiet. Javier didn't go quiet easily. The mine, a dark entrance cut into the hillside, framed by rock and shadow, the kind of place that smells like old decisions. Lloyd had plans for it. He always had plans. But first he needed to know what was inside. His scanning skill illuminated the cavern in green light, and what it showed him made the grin fall off his face. The mine was not empty. Something lived in its depths. Something with too many legs and eyes that glowed red in the dark. Giant insectoid creatures, a colony of them, nesting in the tunnels he had. Planned to excavate. Lloyd stood at the entrance for a long moment, then he summoned again. The second creature was pink. It bounced when it landed. It had a bell. It looked at Lloyd with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. He named it Bangle. Then he pointed it at the mine. Bangle ate dirt, enthusiastically, with the same ferocious commitment Podong brought to everything it did. And then, because the universe apparently had a sense of humor, it launched projectiles, steel ones, at high velocity. The mine suddenly had a very different atmosphere. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a construction project with monsters in it, Lloyd directed. Javier fought. Bangle tunneled. The miners dug with the desperate energy of people who have been told there is no other option. The insects were everywhere, swarming through the tunnels, enormous and relentless and red-eyed in the torchlight. Javier's sword sang through the dark. Bright and desperate and furious, he was bleeding. He had been bleeding for a while, but he kept moving, because the man with the shovel was still in there, and that meant Javier was still in there. Then the oxygen started running out. The HUD that only Lloyd could see flickered red, numbers dropping. He had been so focused on the insects that he hadn't noticed the methane, the gas that had been building in the sealed lower tunnels. The reason no one had mined here in years. He dug, with everything he had. The shovel struck rock. He dug anyway. The oxygen bar hit critical. Javier collapsed somewhere behind him. Lloyd didn't stop. He couldn't stop. This was the vow he had made to himself in the dark on the first night. Not to die in this story. Not like this. Not in a hole in the ground. Nameless, with no one to remember what he'd tried to build. Podong burst from the earth, ecstatic, trailing dirt and debris, and the particular chaos of a creature that has absolutely no concept of the situation's gravity. But it had broken through. Air rushed in. Lloyd gasped. Then he kept digging, because that was what the man with the shovel did. He kept digging. They made it out. Javier carried Lloyd, barely walking, both of them covered in dust and blood and the particular exhaustion of people who have survived something they, Shouldn't have. Above them, the moon hung full and indifferent, the village lights below. Peaceful, unaware of how close everything had just come to ending. But the system had been watching, it always watched. Approval up, RP gained, current RP. 157. He stared at the number from his bed, with a cold compress on his head, and the particular blankness of someone who has not yet decided whether to laugh or cry. Then the system updated again. A reward for heroic courage. RP surged from 7 to 507 in a single notification. Lloyd lay in bed and smiled. The wide, unsettling smile of a man who has just been given exactly what he needs to do something dangerous. The mine was cleared. The tunnels were rebuilt. Workers moved through them with torches and purpose. The three men who had watched Lloyd dig himself half to death now looked at him with something that hadn't been there before. Away. The kind that doesn't come from rank or title, the kind that comes from watching someone refuse to quit. But what the mine contained was not ore, not entirely. In the deepest chamber, bound and unconscious, they found something they hadn't expected. A green-skinned orc, female, enormous. And once the bindings were off, possessed of a pride that filled the room like smoke. She looked at Lloyd the way warriors look at things they are deciding whether to crush. Lloyd looked back with the expression he always wore when a new variable entered his calculations: interest. He offered her a deal. She told him, with considerable force, exactly what he could do with his deal. He smiled and offered it again, because the man with the shovel had learned something in his previous life. The best partnerships are the ones where both sides need each other. She had people, a tribe, warriors who could move stone and haul timber and dig trenches that would take human laborers weeks. He had something they needed, a future. She didn't say yes right away. The orc chief never said yes right away. There were trials. There was a battle in the arena. Two green giants colliding with the force of something geological. Dust erupting. The crowd of orcs watching with the focused intensity of people for whom combat is the only language worth speaking. Lloyd watched from the side, holding his shovel, looking like he had absolutely no business being there. And yet, the orc woman won her fight. She raised the ant's head like a trophy, roaring at the sky. Her tribe roared with her, and Lloyd, the developer in a world of swords, smiled. Because the chief had just proven exactly what he needed to know. They were strong enough. The journey to the orc settlement was long. Sun-baked canyons, red rock and dry wind. Javier walked beside Lloyd with the expression of a man who has accepted that his life is now inexplicable. He had signed on to guard a noble. He had not signed on to march into orc territory with a shovel and two magical creatures on his companions' shoulders. And yet, here he was. Something was watching them. A hooded figure with red eyes, deep in a cave laboratory, studying ancient texts, working on something that had no business being worked on. The kind of work that requires bound men in blood circles, and the specific madness of someone who has convinced themselves the ends justify everything. Lloyd didn't know about the hooded figure yet. He was focused on the orc settlement. Dome structures rising from the desert floor, red-robed figures on the clifftops. And the chief, waiting. The negotiation with the orc leader was not a conversation, it was a test. Every word Lloyd said was weighed, every gesture measured. He sat across from the chief and spoke the only language that matters in any world: mutual benefit. What he offered was simple: work. Honest, well-compensated, meaningful work. The orcs lifting heavy blocks in the quarry, grinning. Not slaves, partners, the chief agreed. Not because Lloyd had charmed him, because the orc woman had told him something. About the mine. About the man who had come into the dark to get her out. About the shovel. The tribe arrived at the Frontera estate with the force of a weather event. Villagers scattered, nobles fled. The terrified couple outside the manor pressed themselves against the wall as green giants passed. Inside, Lloyd's father stared at the scene with the expression of a man who has accepted that he no longer understands his own life. The moneylenders, who had come to collect on a different matter entirely, stared with the particular horror of men watching their leverage evaporate. Lloyd stood in the grand hall, the orc woman beside him. He smiled, the smile of a man who has just played a card nobody knew he was holding. The schemer, wrapped in noble skin, had just changed the balance of everything. He would not forget this moment. But the hooded figure in the cave had not forgotten either. The ritual was nearly complete. The blood circles drawn, the bound men screaming. Something dark and stitched and wrong taking shape in the cavern's depths. Lloyd and Javier walked into it without knowing what they were walking into. That was the thing about the boy who fell into the wrong story. He always walked forward. Even when forward was dark, even when forward smelled like old blood and burning rock, the hooded figure turned. Pink magic erupted, the kind that tears stone, the kind that doesn't distinguish between enemies and walls. Javier moved first. His sword found purchase in the cavern rock. He drove it down with everything he had. The explosion that followed was the kind that rearranges geography, a crater where the ritual circle had been, rock dust settling like snow. The hooded figure tumbled through the debris, screaming not from pain, from fury. Lloyd stood over the fallen figure, shovel in hand. Covered in dust, breathing hard. The hooded figure looked up at him, and Lloyd saw something he hadn't expected. Behind the rage and the dark magic and the ritual blood, grief, the kind that turns people into weapons. He didn't kill the figure. He never killed when he didn't have to. He just stood there, letting the dust settle, letting the moment breathe. The figure bowed eventually, head to the dusty ground, gratitude or defeat or something in between, but the dark magic was not done. The mutated creature it had been building, stitched together from pieces of things that shouldn't be combined, roared in the cavern depths. Purple energy crackled, the kind that doesn't stop when the caster falls. Javier met it with his sword. The battle that followed was the kind the histories don't record. No witnesses, no glory. Just two young men in a dark hole, fighting something that should not exist, and a man with a shovel making sure they had an exit. They emerged into sunlight, battered, exhausted, but alive. The construction site waited for them, dusty and loud and completely indifferent to what they had just survived. Lloyd looked at it. Then he picked up his shovel and got back to work, because that was the vow, not heroism, not glory. Build, keep building, no matter what gets in the way. The underworld, it turned out, had noticed him. A notification, the strangest one yet, arrived while he was walking a sunlit hallway. An offer, from a ruler of the dead. Lloyd read it. He laughed. The kind of laugh that means he was already thinking about how to use it. The wetlands were next. A desolate marsh at the edge of the Frontera lands. Useless, everyone said. Worthless, the kind of land that gets left off maps. Lloyd waded into it, boots splashing through shallow water. Javier beside him, looking at the sky with the expression of a man reconsidering his life choices. Lloyd crouched at the water's edge. He touched the surface. He ran the numbers in his head. Drainage patterns, soil composition, irrigation potential. What everyone else saw as a wasteland, the developer in a world of swords saw as farmland waiting to be freed. He sat in the dirt for a long time, thinking, calculating. The moon rose. Owls called in the dark forest. He kept thinking. He had dug a maze in the barren dirt, drainage channels. The beginnings of something. He raised his fist at the moon, scarred arm, clenched tight, not in anger. In declaration, he screamed at the sky. The kind of scream that is not despair, the kind that is triumph announcing itself before the work is done. The system rewarded him. A new skill. Unlocked. He stared at the notification. Then he looked at the marsh, then at his hands. Dirty, calloused. The hands of a man who had stopped pretending he was anything other than what he was. A builder, in a world that had no word for what he was doing. Podong and Bongul sat on his shoulders, both of them looking at him with the uncomplicated devotion of creatures who have decided this person is their person. He held Podong for a moment, then set them both down on the sandy ground, gently, the way you set something down when you need both hands for what comes next. The sunrise came over the desert, gold and vast, the kind of morning that feels like a promise. Stage 1 of the Merritt's Wetlands Reclamation Project, he said it aloud, standing in a sun-baked landscape with a shovel on his shoulder and two small creatures at his feet. The one who chose to build when everyone else chose to fight, looking at a glowing orb above him, the summoning circle activating at his feet. Green light, gears turning, something coming. The circle erupted with a sound like the world cracking open. And whatever emerged from it hit Lloyd with the force of something that had been waiting a very long time to arrive. He staggered. He didn't fall. The man with the shovel never fell. But whatever had just been summoned, whatever ancient, impossible thing the random system had decided to give him this time, was going to change everything. Again. It wasn't a skill. Not in any sense Lloyd understood. It was something older than a skill. Something the system had been holding back, waiting for exactly the right moment of desperation, and now it had arrived. Podong, round, golden, absurd, and somehow impossibly real. The creature landed on the dry earth with a sound like a question no one had thought to ask. Lloyd stared at it. He held up the paper the system had produced, dripping, improbable, covered in instructions he barely believed. He read it again. Then he looked at the creature, and something in his chest, Something that had been wound tight since the moment he woke up in this story began, very slowly, to loosen, because the man with the shovel had just been given a water source in a land that had none. The creature drank from rivers that didn't exist yet. It pulled water from the air, from the soil, from places that logic had long since abandoned. Lloyd watched it work. He watched it with the focused, calculating attention of a man who had spent his entire previous life studying civil engineering, and he thought quietly, precisely about what this meant. It meant irrigation, it meant crops, it meant survival. But then the creature sneezed, and the world remembered that it was enormous. The vortex came without warning, a spinning column of water that punched skyward from nothing. Lloyd screamed, not in triumph. In the specific, undignified horror of a man who has just realized his asset is also a natural disaster. The two tiny creatures sitting nearby looked entirely unbothered. They always did. He would need to control this. That was the first lesson the system had taught him, and he had learned it slowly, painfully, through every project that had almost killed him. Power without direction is just destruction with a better personality. He had to direct it, and so the man with the shovel got back to work. The marshland stretched for miles under a pale, indifferent sky. It was the kind of land that broke men's spirits before it broke their backs. Flat, wet, useless, or so everyone had always believed. Lloyd didn't believe in useless land. He believed in bad engineering. He screamed at workers who moved too slowly. He drove them harder than any noble had ever dared, and they followed him because somehow, impossibly, he was always right. The shovel rose, the earth moved. Something was taking shape in the dirt, a channel, then a field, then something that looked, against all odds, like hope. But hope in this world had a habit of attracting enemies. The nobleman arrived on horseback, the kind of man who wore his contempt like a second coat. He had heard about the land, he had heard about the crops, and he had come to remind Lloyd, in the particular way that powerful men remind those below them, exactly who owned what. Lloyd stood in the field and listened. He listened with his arms loose at his sides and his face arranged into something that looked almost like deference. Almost, because the schemer wrapped in noble skin had already thought 3 steps ahead. He reached into the field and pulled out an onion, just an onion. He held it up to the nobleman's face, grinning, unhurried, and presented it like evidence at a trial. The nobleman's face went through several colors. He raged. He threatened. He counted on his fingers the ways in which Lloyd had violated every land act he could name, and Lloyd smiled. He smiled because he had already planted the seed, not in the ground, but in the mind of every farmer watching. Years later, those farmers would remember this moment. The riders left. The cheering that followed was quiet, the kind that happens when people don't yet trust their own joy. But it was real, and Lloyd stood in it, breathing in the smell of turned earth and distant water, and felt something he hadn't felt since arriving in this story. Momentum. To survive and to thrive by reshaping the world around him with his mind and his shovel, one project at a time. That was the vow he had made to himself in the dark, in the early days, when everything was panic and confusion, and he had not broken it yet. The rain came that night, heavy, relentless, the kind of rain that turns roads into rivers and ambitions into mud. Lloyd sat in it. He sat hunched on a wet slope and let the water run down his neck and thought about water wheels, because that was who he was. The man who looked at a flood and saw infrastructure. By morning, the sky had cleared. The stone path wound through grass that glittered with what the rain had left behind. And Lloyd stood on a hill with Javier beside him, looking out at what the land was becoming. Javier said nothing. He had learned, slowly and with great reluctance, that silence was sometimes the only honest response to Lloyd. The notification came quietly, a soft chime in the back of Lloyd's awareness. Approval ratings climbing, progress points stacking. The system rewarding him for doing what engineers had always done, solving problems no one else had bothered to frame correctly. But somewhere in a grand city far away, a different kind of accounting was taking place. An old man sat behind a desk and slammed his fist down on it. The papers scattered. A merchant bowed and delivered news that made the old man's face go white. Someone had turned a dead territory into a golden goose. And the old men who had written that territory off, who had laughed at the Israhan name, were now staring at the numbers and feeling something that powerful men rarely feel. Jealousy, followed almost immediately by hunger. Something was coming for what Lloyd had built. He woke to a headache, the kind that sits behind the eyes and pulses with the rhythm of every bad decision you've ever made. He stood on his bed in the opulent room they'd given him, A room that still felt borrowed, still felt like a costume, and tried to organize his thoughts. Javier was in the next room, clutching a pillow, startled awake by something Lloyd had apparently shouted in his sleep. Lloyd didn't apologize. He never apologized for the things his brain did at 3 in the morning. He just sat down and started planning. The territory needed a water supply contract. It needed infrastructure that could outlast the politics that surrounded it. It needed something so permanent, so obviously valuable, that even the men who hated Lloyd would hesitate before tearing it down. He had been reading, devouring every book about this world's engineering, its geology, its water tables, and in the margins of those books, in the spaces between what this world knew and what his old world had learned, he had found the answer: an aqueduct, Roman scale, stone-arched, spanning the canyon like a declaration. The boy who fell into the wrong story was about to build something that had no name in this world. The men in the opulent rooms had no idea what was coming. They sat in their formal chambers and argued about land rights and noble precedent. One of them, a man with a goatee and the particular smirk of someone who has never been truly surprised, believed he had Lloyd cornered. He slammed tea across the table. He made demands. He threatened the kind of ruin that only men with old money and long memories can threaten. Lloyd let him finish. Then Lloyd made him sign. The contract was presented with the practiced calm of a man who had already won. The old judge's hands shook as he read it. He understood in that moment that he had been maneuvered, that every argument he had made, every threat he had leveled had been anticipated and redirected like water through a channel. He screamed. He raged against chains of his own making. And Lloyd stood over him, the man with the shovel, the developer in a world of swords, and felt nothing except the quiet satisfaction of a problem. Solved. He held a notebook in his hands. He was already on the next project. The aqueduct went up in stages. Workers dug trenches around bamboo pipes that Lloyd had designed from memory and instinct. Javier watched the construction from a distance, sword at his hip, expression unreadable. He had stopped asking questions about where Lloyd's knowledge came from. The answers were always unsatisfying and slightly terrifying. When the first stones were blasted from the canyon wall, Javier's sword doing the work of dynamite, the rocks fell into the river below with a sound like the world making room. Lloyd stood at the edge and looked down at the churning water. He could see it already. The arches, the channels, the flow. He could see the version of this territory that existed 6 months from now. And it was magnificent. But someone was watching. The nobleman in the city gnawed his finger and sweated through his coat. He had received reports. An aqueduct in the Asrahan territory, built by a boy with dirt under his fingernails and a mind that moved like something from another world entirely. The old judge laughed, the wrong kind of laugh, the kind that lives just next door to screaming. He had a plan. He always had a plan. But Lloyd had already anticipated it. He reclined with a smug smile in the warm light of his study and waited for the next move. The schemer wrapped in noble skin had learned something important about this world. In a world of swords, the man who controls the water controls everything, and he intended to control the water. The aqueduct was completed on a clear morning. It stood over the river like something that had always been there. Patient, inevitable, Roman. Workers who had doubted every step of the process stood beneath it and went silent. That silence was the best payment Lloyd ever received. He walked away from it without looking back. The man with the shovel never lingered at his own monuments. He was already thinking about the next one. The road to the next project took them through a village that had not yet decided what it thought of Lloyd. Peaceful on the surface, complicated underneath. Javier walked beside him, occasionally glancing over with the expression of a man who has accepted that he will never fully understand his employer. Lloyd smiled confidently at the sky. He had a new problem to solve. A nobleman had come to him in desperation, kneeling, head bowed, the pride of an old house ground down to nothing. He knelt before Lloyd in a grand room and begged. Lloyd looked down at him with the particular skepticism of someone who has been begged before and found it largely unconvincing. The man's despair was real enough. His finances were a ruin, his territory was failing, and he had come to the one person in the kingdom who seemed to understand how to turn failure into something else. Lloyd rested his chin on his hand. He thought about it for exactly as long as it took to calculate the profit. Then he smiled. The water supply contract was signed. Both men knew who had gotten the better deal. Only one of them was happy about it. The city they traveled to next was grand in the way that old power is always grand, heavy, imposing, built to make you feel small. A statue was being built in its harbor, something enormous. Count Cremo stood at his window and watched the sea with the intensity of a man who suspects the ocean of having opinions about him. He was not wrong to be suspicious, because the ocean had something in it, something old, something that moved beneath the surface with the patience of a creature that has never needed to hurry. A dragon, red-scaled, ancient, erupting from the water with a fury that had been building for longer than anyone in this story had been alive. Lloyd was not in the city when it appeared. He was in a garden, of all places, pruning. Javier stood nearby, watching him with the resigned expression of a man who has accepted that his employer will find something productive to do at the worst possible moment. Lloyd knelt in the foliage and looked at a plant and thought about a mermaid, not a real one, a statue. He had been reading about the harbor, about the sea monster attacks, about the way that Count Cremo's territory sat exposed to the ocean like an open wound. And he had a solution. He always had a solution. But this one required something unusual. It required trust. Javier had been watching Lloyd for long enough to know that trust was not something Lloyd asked for lightly. He had earned it in the way that competence always eventually earns trust, slowly, through a series of moments where being wrong would have been catastrophic. Javier looked at the wooden sword on the wall of his room. It was cracked now. Someone had stepped on it. He didn't talk about what that meant to him. But Lloyd had noticed. The developer in A World of Swords noticed everything. He filed it away, the way he filed away everything, in the part of his mind that was always calculating, always preparing, always 3 moves ahead of the current crisis. He snapped his fingers. The plan was in motion. The assassin came at midnight. Through the window, under the full moon, with the practiced silence of someone who had done this before. Javier was asleep, or appeared to be. The sword came down in a bright arc of red energy, and Javier was already moving. The clash was brutal and brief and conducted entirely in the dark. Steel on steel, fury on fury, the hooded figure giving everything and Javier giving more. When it was over, the assassin was on the floor. Javier stood over him, breathing hard, hands still tight on the hilt. Lloyd, in the next room, had slept through all of it, or claimed to. The morning came clean and bright, as mornings do after violence, and Lloyd was already outside, already working. The bamboo pipe system was the next phase. He had designed it over 3 nights with a piece of charcoal and a stolen map. He explained it to Javier in a dry, sun-drenched field, pointing at the ground with the kind of enthusiasm that made Javier deeply nervous. Javier stared at the barren earth. He stared at Lloyd. He stared at the shovel. Lloyd shrugged with the serene confidence of a man who has already done the math. He turned away and began to dig. Javier, after a long moment of internal struggle, picked up a tool and followed. This was always how it went. Lloyd pulled people into his orbit through sheer undeniable results, not through charm, not through inspiration. Through the simple, devastating power of being right. The water flowed through the bamboo pipes on the day they finished, clear, cold, rushing into the stream with a sound that made the workers stop and stare. Javier's approval rating ticked upward in the system's quiet accounting. Lloyd grinned at the notification. He grinned at the large green structure they had built together. He was accumulating something more valuable than money. He was accumulating loyalty, to survive and to thrive by reshaping the world around him with his mind and his shovel, one project at a time. Every project was a link in a chain, and the chain was getting long. The journey to Count Cremo's territory was cold. They traveled through snow-covered landscapes under skies that offered no encouragement. A lone tower stood against the clouds, isolated and proud. Ships were docked in the harbor, below a city that looked like it had been built to withstand something. Count Cremo received them in a grand hall with the measured warmth of a man who is evaluating his options. He was bearded, regal, and deeply, visibly skeptical. Lloyd sat across from him and looked thoughtful. The Count's territory was being destroyed by sea monsters. Not metaphorically, literally. Giant ancient ocean-born things that rose from the depths and tore ships apart. The Count had tried swords. He had tried soldiers. He had tried everything that a man of swords and soldiers tries. And now he was kneeling, metaphorically, barely, before a boy with dirt under his fingernails and a shovel he carried everywhere. Lloyd proposed a statue, a mermaid, muscular, proud, standing between the ships and the sea like a guardian made of stone. The Count stared at him. Lloyd stared back. The Count asked how a statue was supposed to stop a sea monster. Lloyd explained, and as he explained, something shifted in the room. The Count stopped looking at Lloyd like a problem. He started looking at him like a solution. The construction of the Kassan was the most dangerous thing Lloyd had attempted yet. He had designed it from principles he half remembered from a structural engineering textbook he'd read in his second year of university. Workers poured cement from ships into rough seas that didn't care about deadlines. Javier swung a massive hammer against stone walls, his sword-trained arms finding new purpose. He complained about it constantly. Lloyd ignored him with the practiced ease of a man who has learned to treat complaints as background noise. The stone blocks went into the water one by one, each one a declaration. Each one a refusal to accept that this world's problems had only this world's solutions. Podong helped. In the way that Pipadong always helped, which was to say chaotically joyfully and at great risk to everyone nearby. The yellow creature slurped water from the construction site and redirected it with the focused enthusiasm of a creature that has never been told anything is impossible. The mermaid statue rose from the water on the day the sea was calm. It stood between the ships and the horizon like a promise. Two men in a rowboat circled it, yelling with excitement. The Count stood on his ship deck and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Lloyd. Lloyd was already looking at the sea. He was always looking at the next horizon. But the sea had its own ideas. The wave came without warning. A monstrous swell that rose from nothing and drove toward the ships with the intention of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The stone titan came with it, ancient, armored, rising from the deep with a spear that could punch through a hull like paper. The banquet they had been attending, nobles mingling in warm light, wine in hand, became something else entirely. The ship lurched. The lights swayed. And somewhere out in the dark water, something enormous had decided that tonight was the night. Javier was on the deck before anyone else, sword drawn, hair whipping in the sea wind, the kind of calm that only comes to people who have been afraid so many times they've made peace with it. He plunged into the water, down into the dark, toward the chains that anchored the monster to its purpose. He fought underwater, sword against chain, breath against the ocean's indifference. The creature above him was enormous. Its glowing eyes cut through the murk like accusations. Bangul, meanwhile, had entered the fight in the only way Bangul knew how, with a mace, and a great deal of personal conviction. The battle at sea was the kind that doesn't end cleanly. Ships pitched in the dark, men fell overboard. The monster's attacks came in waves, literal and figurative, each one more devastating than the last. Javier surfaced, gasping, and immediately lunged back into the fight. He was bleeding, he didn't stop. Lloyd watched from the deck. He gripped a wooden pole and screamed, not in fear, but in the specific, targeted fury of a man who has a plan that is currently not working fast enough. He had known this was coming. He had read about the creature in the Count's records. He had planned for it. But planning for a sea monster and standing on a ship while a sea monster attacks are two different experiences. The man with the shovel had no sword. He had something better. He had Podong. The creature hit the water like a golden comet. It landed on the monster's head with a sound like a declaration of war. The ocean erupted, a wave of such force that it swallowed ships and flung men through the air like arguments. And in the middle of all of it, Lloyd stood on the deck and raised his shovel, the one who chose to build when everyone else chose to fight. Standing in the wreckage of a sea battle, holding a construction tool, refusing to be anything other than exactly what he was, the monster fell, not elegantly. Nothing about that night was elegant. But it fell. Javier floated on a piece of wreckage afterward, staring up at the stars. He was exhausted in a way that went deeper than muscles. Lloyd sat beside him on the raft, paddle in hand, looking at the horizon. He said something. Javier didn't respond, but his approval rating went up. The Count's harbor had been saved. The mermaid statue stood undamaged. And Lloyd sat on Podong's back in the rough sea, relief written across every line of his face. He had survived. Again. The man with the shovel always survived. But the cost was rising. The next monster was already moving. Somewhere in the mountains, under a darkened, stormy sky, something red and ancient was waking up. The reports reached Lloyd in fragments. A letter arrived by carrier pigeon, white wings against a gray sky, an urgency that didn't need translation. Lloyd read it. His hand tightened on the paper. He was on a horse before the ink was dry. The ride through the snow was brutal. The kind of cold that gets into the bones and stays there. Through riders on horseback, pushing through a blizzard that didn't care about urgency. Lloyd's expression in the snow was the one he always wore when he was afraid. Not the wide-eyed panic of someone who doesn't know what's coming. The tight, controlled grimace of someone who knows exactly what's coming and is trying to get there first. The wolves found them in the forest. Monstrous things, not natural wolves, but the kind that this world produced in its darker corners. Javier drew his blade in the snow. He faced them with the grim determination of a man who has fought too many things to be surprised by another one. The fight was savage and cold and conducted in the dark between the trees. Steel flashed, blood hit the snow. The wolf died with a sword in its chest and a look of surprise on its enormous face. Javier stood over it, breathing hard, arm bleeding. He would not be slowing down. But the horns in the forest were not finished. Dark shapes emerged from between the trees, more wolves. More of them than anyone had expected. Javier stood in the falling snow with his sword raised and his eyes hard. He was injured. He was outnumbered. He fought anyway, because that was who Javier was, the boy who had been handed a broken world and had decided quietly, stubbornly, to stand in front of it. Lloyd appeared at the edge of the clearing. He stood in the snow, observed by three figures, his expression carrying the weight of everything he had calculated on the ride here. He had something. He always had something. The shovel rose, and the man with the shovel lunged forward into the dark. What happened in the forest that night, what Lloyd did with a construction tool against creatures built for killing, would be spoken about in the territory for years. Not loudly, in the way that impossible things are always spoken about, quietly, with a slight shaking of the head. The dragon came next. It descended through misty mountains like something that had been promised. Red, enormous, ancient, the kind of creature that makes the concept of swords seem optimistic. It hit the town with a force that shattered buildings and sent people fleeing through the streets. Javier was already moving, his sword a line of fire against the dark sky. He had fought sea monsters. He had fought wolves in blizzards. A dragon was simply the next item on a list that had never made any sense. He dodged the claw. He parried the tail. He crashed through a wall and got back up, and then he fell. The dragon was too fast, too strong, too old. Javier lay on the ground and looked up at it with the expression of a man who has run out of options. Then Lloyd appeared on the rooftop. He was holding a staff. He was screaming something. Something that, if you had been close enough to hear it, would have sounded less like a battle cry and more like a very specific engineering instruction. Podong answered. The creature hit the dragon with the force of something that has no concept of the word impossible. The dragon recoiled. Bangle followed, mace swinging a tiny furious shape against the enormous red body. Javier from the ground watched his companions fight a dragon. He got up. He always got up. The final exchange was everything. Javier's sword against the dragon's maw, thrust into the fire, held there by pure, screaming will. The creature unleashed a blast that should have ended him. It didn't. The dragon fell. It fell through smoke and ruin and landed in the snow outside the town with a sound like the end of something. Javier collapsed beside it. He was alive, barely. Lloyd found him in a clearing, surrounded by small creatures that had gathered around him with the instinctive concern of things that don't understand death but recognize its proximity. Lloyd knelt beside him. He placed his hand on Javier's chest, and something passed between them that had no name in either of their languages. Not gratitude, not apology, something older and quieter. The blue energy that crackled around the rock formation nearby was the system's response to what they had done. The level up came with a sound like the world acknowledging something. Lloyd sat back and looked at the numbers. They were good numbers. But he was already thinking about what came next. To survive, and to thrive, by reshaping the world around him with his mind and his shovel. One project at a time, he had survived the sea, he had survived the wolves, he had survived the dragon. And the town they had saved was now looking at him the way that towns look at people who have saved them. With the particular, complicated gratitude of people who are not entirely sure whether to be relieved or afraid. A crowd gathered before the grand building, people murmured. A young girl clasped her hands and looked down. A young man clutched his hat and bowed his head. And Lloyd stood in the middle of all of it and felt the weight of what he had become. Not a hero. He had never wanted to be a hero. He had wanted to go home, but home had stopped being a direction and started being a feeling, and that feeling was here, in the cold air, in the faces of the people who had survived because of him. The news reached the capital before he did. Stories travel faster than people in a world where stories are the only currency that matters. The royal capital stood under a hazy sky, grand and indifferent. Inside its halls, figures moved in golden light with the careful deliberateness of people who have spent their lives managing power. The empress sat on her throne with a sword across her lap. She had heard about the boy who had built an aqueduct, about the mermaid statue, about the dragon. Her expression gave nothing away, but someone was watching. Someone in the capital had decided that Lloyd's story needed to be redirected. The bonus RP arrived in a flood. 1,500 points, a number that made Lloyd shout in the empty room. He sat down on the couch and thought about what to spend it on. The mana heart pulsed in the dark of his awareness. Something new, something the system had been keeping back until he was ready for it. He stared at the glowing blue skill card in his hand, Shock Neutralizer. He clenched his fist around it and looked unimpressed. He was always unimpressed by things that were supposed to impress him, but he filed it away. Everything went into the filing system. The carriage arrived at the palace in the early morning. Lloyd sat in it and looked out the window at a snowy town that was still piecing itself back. Together, Newman sat across from him, arms crossed, red coat immaculate despite everything. He had been quiet for most of the journey. That was unusual. The conversation that followed was conducted in the particular register of two men who are not saying what they actually mean. Newman said things about the capital, about the Empress, about the way that power in this kingdom had a way of consuming the people who attracted it. Lloyd listened. He listened with the focused attention of a man who is calculating. The carriage wheel rumbled over cobblestones. They were getting close. The ceremony at the palace was formal and golden and entirely unlike anything Lloyd had prepared for. A crowd cheered as the carriage arrived. Lloyd rested his chin on his hand and looked overwhelmed. Not by the crowd, by the calculation of what the crowd represented. He stood in the grand hall and exhaled smoke. People called his name. He looked bored. He was not bored. His hand touched the glowing orb on the red cushion. He thought about wealth. He thought about what wealth could build. The Empress looked down at him from her throne, red-haired, regal, carrying the specific weight of someone who has been in power long enough to stop trusting anyone who wants it. Lloyd knelt. The red carpet was soft under his knees. He kept his eyes down. He was thinking about the next project. The Empress asked him something. Her expression was the kind that doesn't reveal which answer she's hoping for. Lloyd answered. He answered with the practiced calm of a man who has had this conversation in his head 100 times already. The Empress's expression shifted. Not much, but enough. She looked at him the way that powerful people look at other powerful people when they first recognize what they're dealing with. With a mixture of interest and caution, she signed the document. Her pen moved across the paper with the deliberate authority of someone who understands that this is a moment. Lloyd walked out of the grand hall with a scroll in his hand. He looked surprised, not because he hadn't expected it, but because expecting something and receiving it are two different experiences. He had been given a task, a royal task, and with it access to resources and territories that made everything he had built so far look like a rough draft. Javier walked beside him down the grand hall. His steps were measured, his expression unreadable. But Lloyd noticed the small, barely visible exhale of relief he always noticed. Time passed, the way time passes in stories like this, in flashes, in montages, in the space between one project and the next. Construction notifications chimed, bonus RP accumulated. Workers built wooden structures under bright blue skies. The man with the shovel stood beside Javier and looked at what they had made. He calculated profits under a cloudy sky with the focused pleasure of someone who has found his purpose. He grinned the grin of a man who is winning. Not at combat, not at politics, at the thing he had always been best at, making something out of nothing. A herald arrived with a trumpet and a royal decree. Knights escorted a royal carriage through a sunlit procession. Lloyd stood in the grand hall looking disheveled and blank. He had been summoned. Again, the Empress had more work for him. He slumped on the carriage seat and looked troubled. Not because the work was too much, but because the man with a sharp grin in the corner of his awareness was always there, watching. The royal guards escorted the carriage away from the palace under a bright, hopeful sky. The Empress stood in the grand hall and watched them go. Her expression was the kind that comes after a decision has been made, settled, certain, and somewhere in the palace, a bearded man stood with his arms crossed and watched the same departure with a very different expression. Calculating. The Royal Academy stood under a bright, clear sky, ornate, grand, built to produce the next generation of this kingdom's power. Lloyd arrived with a pouch in his hand and confusion on his face. He was not a student. He was not a teacher. He was something the Academy had no category for. A young woman glared at him the moment he walked through the door. A red-haired boy stared at him with the focused suspicion of someone who has already decided he's a problem. Lloyd dropped his heavy sack on the floor of the grand hall. He looked around at the faces looking back at him. He exhaled. This was a different kind of territory. No marshland to drain here. No aqueduct to build. The politics here were social, hierarchical, and conducted over dinner tables with the particular cruelty that only institutions can sustain. Several men dined in a well-lit restaurant. Lloyd sat with arms crossed and watched a red-haired boy read a menu with the intensity of someone who has been taught that weakness is a choice. The boy was called Julian. He had the particular combination of pride and fragility that comes from being talented in a place that rewards cruelty. The blonde man at the table hit him, casually, the way that people hit others when they have never been made to stop. Lloyd watched. He ate his steak. He thought about what he was seeing. The old men at the table snickered. The portly man smirked, and Lloyd set down his fork. What followed was not elegant. The schemer wrapped in noble skin had a temper. He kept it locked most of the time, behind the calculations, behind the plans, behind the practiced indifference. But watching a boy get hit for sport was the key that opened the lock. He slapped the blonde man, then the other one. The room erupted. The blonde man came back with rage and fire and the specific, wounded fury of someone who has never been challenged. He hit Lloyd. Lloyd bled from the nose. He grinned. The kind of grin that appears on the face of someone who has already decided how this ends. The fight was brief and decisive, and conducted with the kind of controlled violence that comes from someone who has been in worse situations. The blonde man went down, then down again. Lloyd stood over him and grabbed his face. He pointed at the bloody shadow on the wall. He said something quiet and specific and final. The old scholars in the hall murmured with disbelief. An old merchant shouted. Lloyd adjusted his collar. He reached into his coat and produced a pocket watch. The old merchant stared at it. Then Lloyd conjured something. A golden dragon, not real, not physical, but something so precisely and deliberately constructed that the room went silent. It radiated power and awe in equal measure. The old men knelt, not willingly, but knelt. Lloyd stood over them with the developer in a world of swords written in every line of his posture. He walked out of the hall, determined. The Empress's red-haired woman watched him go, with an expression that had moved past suspicion and arrived at something more complicated. The red-haired girl yelled in the background. Lloyd didn't turn around. He had already moved on. He found Javier in a warm room and gave him advice about the academy with the confidence of a man who has already mapped the social terrain. Javier looked skeptical. He always looked skeptical. A girl with freckles sat in the corner of the room, anxious, watching them both. She had wide eyes and the particular tension of someone who is trying very hard to disappear. Lloyd noticed her. He rubbed his nose with a sly smile. He was already thinking about how she fit into the next calculation. The grand palace stood under a dark, mountainous sky. Mystery in its architecture, anticipation in its empty hallways. Two men sat in plush chairs and discussed Lloyd with disdain in a dimly lit room. They had heard about the dinner table. They had formed opinions. Lloyd, meanwhile, stood at an ornate door and hesitated. He was anxious, not often. But here, he opened the door. Two young men sat opposite each other in a warm room. A tense silence hung between them like a question neither was ready to answer. The red-haired girl in the corner gasped in disbelief. Javier contemplated something, his expression soft, thoughtful, carrying the weight of everything the last few months had cost him. A dark-haired man spoke with intensity from the shadows. Something was being decided. Lloyd gasped in shock. He sweated, eyes narrowed. Dark background pressing in. Javier sat with his eyes closed, a somber weight to his stillness. Lloyd exhaled deeply. He placed his hand on his chest. He thought about the vow, to survive and to thrive by reshaping the world around him with his mind and his shovel, one project at a time. He had built channels and aqueducts and mermaid statues and caissons. He had faced nobles and sea monsters and dragons and old men with powdered wigs. He had turned dead land into living territory, and now he was in a school, surrounded by people who had power and no idea how to use it for anything other than hurting each other. The freckled girl looked up with a weary smile. It was the smile of someone who has been waiting for something to change. Lloyd looked at her. She smiled warmly, bathed in soft golden light, and the man with the shovel, the boy who fell into the wrong story, the schemer wrapped in noble skin, the developer in a world of swords, understood that the academy was not a detour. It was the next project. The notification came quietly, Julian's approval rating, ticking upward, the first thread of something new. The Academy had enemies Lloyd hadn't mapped yet, alliances he hadn't traced. And somewhere in the halls of that grand institution, someone had already noticed him, had already started calculating. The man with the shovel had walked into a new kind of battlefield, and the rules here were written in blood and legacy and the particular cruelty of people who have never had to build anything. He would learn them. He would rewrite them, one project at a time. But first, there was the matter of a bridge, not a metaphor. An actual bridge, stone and cable and ambition, stretched across a river that had never been crossed before. And the man with the shovel had decided he was going to build it. Not because anyone asked him to, not because it was safe, because survival, in this world, required more than a sword. It required something they hadn't thought to value: infrastructure. The blueprint sat in his hands like a weapon. He had drawn it himself, pulled the knowledge from a life he'd lived in a different world entirely. And now he was walking it into the workshop of the most stubborn craftsman in the kingdom. Corgidus, royal dwarf master craftsman, did not impress easily. He sat in his dimly lit room with a bottle and a scowl and the particular arrogance of a man who had never been wrong. Lloyd laid the scroll down in front of him. Corgidus looked at it the way a lion looks at a house cat, with contempt and then with something else, something that might have been curiosity. The trust system was unlike anything this world had ever designed. It was borrowed from a civilization that hadn't been born yet, and it was going to work. Corgidus knew it. He hated that he knew it. But a craftsman's hands do not lie, and his hands were already reaching for the plans. Something was shifting in that workshop. The developer in A World of Swords had just recruited his first reluctant ally, and outside, the work had already begun. Sparks flew in the forge, metal beams glowed orange in the dark. Podong, that ridiculous, magnificent creature, hauled rope with the enthusiasm of someone who had never been told what was impossible. The rope itself was being manufactured at a scale this city had never seen, thick, heavy, engineered. The man with the shovel stood on the scaffolding and looked at what was being built. He yelled at Podong. Podong ignored him and kept rolling. This was somehow going according to plan. The tower groaned. The crowd below held its breath. Among them, Javier, watching with eyes that had not yet decided what they felt. A young woman with freckles looked up at the structure with something between wonder and dread. And then the cable connected, and the bridge held. The suspension bridge of Magenta City, complete. Sunlight fell across it like an approval. The kind of approval that could not be argued with. A queen stood before it. Guards flanked her, and Corgidus, that gruff, impossible man, stood in the crowd with his bottle and his scowl. But his eyes were different now. Something had been proven today that could not be unproven. The schemer wrapped in noble skin had done it again. He stood with his hands clasped, looking down at the red carpet beneath his feet, not triumphant, not yet, because the queen was watching, and the queen, red-haired, calculating, regal in a way that felt like a warning, had not yet decided what he was, an asset or a threat. She would have to choose. But that reckoning was still coming. What came first was the palace. The grand hall with its red carpet and its gilded walls and its particular cruelty of ceremony. Men in robes sat in judgment. A blonde nobleman knelt on the floor before them, not Lloyd. Someone else, someone whose fate had already been written. The executioner raised his axe. The two watching nobles smiled the way people smile when they've already won. And the queen, standing on her balcony, wrapped in golden light, screamed, not from grief, from fury, because this was a world where power wore many masks. And the mask of nobility hid the oldest cruelty of all, the belief that some lives were simply worth less. Lloyd had read this story. He knew how it ended, which meant he knew what he had to do before it did. He knelt on the red carpet. He presented the scroll. The queen read it. Her expression shifted. From suspicion to something harder to name, he had offered her something that no sword could buy. A plan. A future. And she was not entirely sure whether to be grateful or terrified. The men with mustaches shouted their objections. The advisors exchanged worried glances. But the queen was already thinking, and when a queen thinks, really thinks, the room goes quiet. Something was coming. The kind of something that rewrites the arrangement of power in a kingdom. But before that, before any of it, there was the matter of a banquet. The nobles had gathered in their finest. A string quartet played in the corner. Wine was held with the casual arrogance of people who had never worried about where it came from. Lloyd stood at the edge of it all, adjusting his collar, watching. The boy who fell into the wrong story had learned by now to read a room. And this room was full of calculation. A blue-haired noble caught his eye. The queen moved through the hall like a tide. Men bowed as she passed, each bow a little lower than the last. She stopped in front of him. He sweated. She leaned in, and for just a moment, one fractured, impossible moment, there was something soft in her eyes, something that had nothing to do with politics. But he didn't know what to do with soft. He knew blueprints. He knew leverage. He knew that somewhere in this hall, behind every smile, someone was calculating how to use him. And then it happened. Not a political move, not a betrayal, something worse. Sir Kyle, the swordmaster, the knight in the red cloak with the golden dragon, turned, and the banquet became a battlefield. Years later, he would remember the exact moment the music stopped. Swords were drawn in the grand hall, men fell. Blood crossed the marble floor in long, terrible arcs. The queen charged forward, not fleeing, never fleeing. She screamed in rage. Her sword met Kyle's blade with a sound like a verdict. Javier fought through the chaos. Newman's silver hair caught the light as he lunged with his cane. The hall was coming apart. Pillars cracked. Explosions rolled through the gilded corridors. Magic that had no business being inside a palace tore through its walls. Someone, a dark-haired figure, was draining the queen's mana, pulling it from her like a thief pulling thread from a tapestry. She gasped. She stumbled. She was not supposed to lose. And yet, Javier screamed her name. Newman drove his sword forward, blood on his hands, fury in his eyes. The blonde knight, the traitor in the red cloak, was still standing, still smiling. That kind of smile that only exists in people who believe they've already won. But the fight was not over. Bearded warriors with glowing swords lunged from the shadows. Green fire erupted from blades that had been dormant for years. The kind of fire that only answers to desperation. Something was coming, had already arrived. A power that had been sleeping inside the young swordsman. And when it woke, when it finally, fully woke, the hall shook. Bearded warriors fell back. Marble cracked in long lines across the floor. And then, silence. The kind of silence that follows destruction. The kind that makes you count who is still standing. Not everyone was. The young swordsman lay on the cracked floor, bloodied. A stern nobleman stood over him, triumphant or trying to be. The battle had been won, but the cost of it had not yet been calculated. He would not forget this. None of them would. Two men crucified under a stormy sky, crows circling. This was the world Lloyd had read about. The world he had fallen into, and somewhere in its darkness a campfire burned. Two men sat beside it, one with auburn hair, one with white. The forest around them was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a disaster. Javier poked the fire with a stick. He did not look up. Lloyd watched him, and said nothing, because some things do not need to be said. They only need to be sat with. The ground between them was drawn in the dirt, a rough map, a plan, always a plan, because the man with the shovel does not stop planning. Not even after the world has tried to kill him, especially not then. To survive and to thrive by reshaping the world around him with his mind and his shovel, one project at a time. That was still the vow, even here, even now. Javier looked up at him with eyes that had been through too much. Eyes that were beginning, slowly, reluctantly, to trust. But what he didn't know was how deep the darkness went, what waited in the halls of power, what was already being set in motion. The queen sat on her throne with a sword nearby and a map on her lap. She was thinking about borders, about enemies, about the particular exhaustion of being the only person in a room who understands what is at stake. Something was wrong with her body. The mana drain had left a mark. She clutched her head, she gasped, and in the chaos that followed, Lloyd ran. Not from cowardice, from necessity. He burst into her chambers. He knelt at her desk. He looked up at her with eyes that were, for once, completely unguarded. She stared back with suspicion so old it had calcified into instinct. He spoke. She listened, and something in the room changed. She leaned forward. A sly smile, the kind she didn't show in public. He had offered her immunity, trust, a way forward. She wrote the document, and he smiled with the particular glee of a man who has just pulled off something he should not have been able to pull off. Years later, he would understand that this was the moment everything truly began. But first, the insects. The monsters came without warning. A village at dusk. The sound of impacts rolling across a green landscape, and then the sky filled with them. Giant insects, red-eyed, mandible-dripping, descending like a verdict. Farmers dropped their tools. Woodcutters stared with their mouths open. A maid recoiled as something crashed through a stone wall. Noble women grabbed servants and ran. A young woman cried, covered in the creatures, in a space too small to escape. And Lloyd, on horseback, riding hard, was already heading toward it. The man with the shovel did not flinch from disaster. He rode into it. Javier rode beside him. Pipodong was already there, somehow inexplicably. Already there. Green-skinned warriors emerged from the tree line. Orcs, allies, improbably, swinging their weapons into the swarm. It was chaos. Beautiful, terrible chaos. A swordsman held his ground in a burning building. A young man fought with a club because he had nothing else. Someone was watching from a distance, a worried man, eyes on a mansion, birds flying overhead like omens, and through all of it, the insects kept coming. Something was coming, something larger than the swarm. The city itself was under siege now. An old nobleman screamed in a grand hall. A wigged judge recoiled in terror. The insects had reached the places where the powerful lived, and the powerful, it turned out, were just as fragile as everyone else. Lloyd fought. He fought with a sword and a shovel and a fury that surprised even him. He screamed at the swarm, and the swarm did not care. But then, a trap. Something he had prepared. A grimace of triumph on a face that had been grimacing all day. The approval ratings ticked upward. The RP accumulated. The schemer wrapped in noble skin had once again found a way to turn catastrophe into currency. But the insects were not the last of it. The swarm broke against the city's defenses. The riders drove them back, and in the aftermath, in the dust and the exhaustion and the strange, ringing quiet, two men fell into water, clutching their heads, laughing maybe, or something close to it. The man with the shovel lay on the grass, looking up at a sky that had for once stopped trying to kill him. He exhaled. He looked surprised, not by the victory, but by the fact that he was still here to have it. He would not forget this. What it cost to keep breathing in a world that wanted you dead. What it felt like to win and still be exhausted. And then, the cavalry arrived. White armor gleaming. Knights on horseback cresting the hill with the particular confidence of people who had arrived after the hard part. A bearded knight dismounted. He looked bewildered. He looked at the battlefield, at the man sitting in the grass with a shovel, and he did not know what to make of either. Commander Valalardi Blanc, a man built from duty and rain and the particular sorrow of soldiers who have seen too many graves. He had sat in the rain before those graves. He had knelt before grieving women with helmets in his hands. He had watched children watch him with eyes that asked questions he couldn't answer. And now he stood in a sunlit town square, his soldiers cheering around him. Because something had changed, something had been won, not by the knights, by the man with the shovel, who had redirected a stampede of mammoths with a flag and a cliff and an absolutely unhinged amount of confidence. It had started with a horde, monstrous beasts charging down from the mountains, mastodons, ancient, enormous, unstoppable. The kind of thing that ends villages, the kind of thing that no amount of swords could stop, but a flag could, or rather, the right flag, in the right place, held by a man who had read enough engineering to know that momentum could be redirected. Lloyd stood on the cliff with two flags and a wind that was trying to knock him off. He held on. He waved. The mammoths turned into the river. The knight who had been ready to die stared at the river, at the wild boars swimming peacefully across it, at the absolute absurdity of what had just happened. Lloyd leaped from the cliff, arms out, exhilarated, the one who chose to build when everyone else chose to fight, and he had won again. A woman cradled a child in the warm light of a sunset. The knight knelt before her, offered the helmet. The village had survived, not because of swords, because of flags and physics and a man who refused to accept the story as written. But what he didn't know was that the cost of this victory was already being tallied, somewhere, by someone. A man with slicked back hair and clasped hands and a smile that had never been sincere. The battles were won. But the war, the real war, was still being planned, 5 figures around a table, tense anticipation in every face. A monstrous bear erupting from dark waters. Something enormous was sleeping in the world, and someone was planning to wake it. Lloyd sat in the library, reading. Always reading, because the boy who fell into the wrong story had learned that knowledge was the only armor that never rusted. He had a plan for the creature, a device, glowing, engineered, impossible. A holographic map that no one in this world should have been able to draw. He gestured over it with the confidence of a man who had already run the numbers. Javier watched him, still conflicted, still pulled between the world he was born into and the one this strange man was building. 3 young men marched across a sunlit field with shovels on their shoulders, like soldiers. But their weapons were wrong, gloriously, defiantly wrong. The man with the shovel had built an army, not of swords, of shovels, and they believed in him, with the particular fervor of people who had never been given a reason to believe in anything. But the creature was still out there, sleeping on its mountain, dreaming whatever ancient things dream, and Lloyd was going to wake it, on purpose, with a plan. The green energy erupted from the mountainside, beasts roared below, the lake, that vast, serene, snow-ringed lake, cracked apart, ice exploded. A waterfall crashed down through lush greenery and debris, and from the water, enormous, furious, very much awake, came the beast, a giant beaver. The most terrifying giant beaver anyone had ever seen. Lloyd stared up at it, the beast stared down at him. Its grin was menacing. His expression was complicated. Something was coming, and it involved a lot of water. Javier was already screaming. Podong was already doing something inexplicable with a rope. The beast charged. Fire erupted from its mouth. Water exploded in every direction. Men fell from cliffs. Men plunged underwater. A small figure swam desperately in dark water. Swords struck the beast. Green energy blazed. And through all of it, the man with the shovel kept moving. He threw a punch at a giant beaver with his fist. This was, objectively, the most unhinged thing he had ever done, and it worked. Sort of. The beast retreated to the forest, sitting in the shade of trees much larger than itself, looking confused, and Lloyd crouched in front of it, smiling. The way you smile at something that could kill you, but probably won't if you're very, very careful. The creature blushed, touched its forehead, looked away. He had somehow befriended it. He named it Bongal. Bongal sat on a throne of warm light, blushing with surprise. Podong laughed with the joy of a creature that has never questioned anything. And Lloyd, the man with the shovel, held them both and looked like a man who had not expected to be this happy. But the world, as always, had other plans. He burst through the door, alarmed, eyes wide. Green monsters were attacking, warriors were falling, and Bongal, that furious, magnificent creature, was already moving, sitting on Lloyd's arm like a general, with the particular authority of something that has recently decided to trust one specific human. The battle was brief. The monsters fell. The orcs cheered, and Lloyd stood in the sunlight with his shovel and his beaver and his impossible army, looking like a man who was, against all odds, winning, to survive and to thrive by reshaping the world around him with his mind and his shovel, one project at a time. He had not forgotten. He would never forget. But the darkness at the edge of the map was growing. Monsters descended on snowy mountains. A colossal shadow loomed under a bright, ominous sky. Something enormous, something ancient, was moving. And somewhere in the east, an old sultan with a turban sat in a sunlit palace, listening, calculating, a document on a desk, a large check, a deal being struck in a room full of ornate furniture and very old money. Lloyd smiled his most dangerous smile, hands clasped, warm light. The debt, that crushing, inherited, impossible debt, was being addressed. Not by fighting, by building, by developing, by reshaping the economic reality of a world that had never heard of urban planning. A peaceful village in a valley, a blueprint on aged parchment, little white figures cheering in identical rooms. The developer in a world of swords was building apartments, and the people were moving in. Tax revenue increased. He sang about it, actually sang, arms raised, in the sunlight, like a man who has been given exactly what he wanted and cannot quite believe it. But the old merchant was watching. The old merchant with the powdered wig and the ancient grudge and the contract that had been designed to be unbreakable. He sat in his opulent room and he stared at the numbers, and he did not like them. He grabbed Lloyd's collar. Rage. The kind of rage that belongs to men who have never been outmaneuvered before. Lloyd was being choked. He was in pain, and he was still smiling, because he had read the contract, and he had found the clause, and the clause meant that the merchant had already lost. He just didn't know it yet. The old man screamed. Red energy radiated from him, the room filled with the particular fury of a man watching his power dissolve. And Lloyd, bruised, exhausted, still smiling, held up the receipt, bathed in warm golden light, triumphant. Someone was weeping. A man embracing another, his face contorted in grief. The debt had been broken. The chain that had been around the Frontera name for longer than Lloyd had been alive. Gone. He sat with it for a moment, eyes downcast, soft light. The particular quiet of a man who has just crossed a threshold he cannot uncross. He smiled serenely, and the golden light agreed with him. But the world was not done. It was never done. Refugees were moving across a vast, bright sky. Hooded travelers leading weary villagers on dusty mountain paths. A grieving woman cradling a baby. Somber figures in a hazy sky. Something had happened to their home. Something with red arrows on a map converging on a single point. A strategic tension that had nothing to do with bridges or apartments. Lloyd looked at the map. He looked at the refugees. He looked at Javier. And he grinned. the sinister, confident grin of a man who has already thought of something. Javier looked worried. He was right to, because the plan involved monstrous worms and locusts and a blonde woman holding strange food and looking thoughtful, and green-skinned warriors hammering tent stakes in bright sunlight, and a white flag being waved with desperate urgency, and Bangle giving a thumbs up. Bangle was always giving thumbs up. It was unclear if Bangle understood what thumbs up meant, but the energy was correct. A crying mother embraced her child in warm, soft light. The refugees had been housed. The crisis had been managed. The man with the shovel knelt in the grass with his tool and his dappled sunlight and his impossible track record. Javier watched him walk away, bathed in bright sunlight, a peaceful outdoor setting, and something in Javier's eyes had finally settled. The long argument between his instincts and his experience resolved. He smiled, serenely, in golden light, and the boy who fell into the wrong story had, without quite meaning to, built something more important than a bridge. He had built a team, but what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the ending had already been written. The game had a conclusion, a fixed point, and under a full moon, dark clouds swirling, ominous, Lloyd lay in the grass with a blue object in his hand. He stared at it, the skill list, the interface, the blue card that should not have existed in this world. He held it with the particular gleeful desperation of a man who has found a cheat code, and then he pressed yes. The ending spoiler loaded, and he saw it, the burning village, the red sky, the blood-splattered ruins, the monstrous insects descending in waves that never ended, the two men crucified under a stormy sky. He had seen this before. He had read this story. He had fallen into it. And now he knew exactly how it ended. He screamed, not from fear, from rage, the kind of rage that is indistinguishable from determination. He stood in the desolate wasteland of the vision, defiant, ominous black shapes above him, and he made a decision. The same decision he had been making since the moment he woke up in this body. To survive, to thrive, to reshape the world around him with his mind and his shovel, one project at a time, and then the volcano, a mountain erupting under dark, stormy skies, casting a dramatic glow over a village below, a knight clutching his head in anguish, soldiers staring at the blazing peak, and Lloyd lying on the snowy ground, a shovel nearby, a blonde knight standing over him, somber. Something had gone wrong here, or something had gone exactly right. It was sometimes hard to tell the difference. Two men argued in a cavernous space, one enraged, one resigned. The shovel had been driven into the earth, grim determination in every inch of the motion, and from the mountain, from the chaos and the fire, a path was being carved, climbers ascending a rocky cliff face. A dragon's head carved into the stone. Under a cloudy sky, he stood on the hill with another man and looked out at the green landscape below. A shovel between them. Bright day, contemplative mood, the kind of moment that only exists between two people who have been through something together and survived. Now came the meeting, the night across the table, intense mood, warm lighting, a masked woman questioning confusion. Sir Byron, stern, battle-worn, contemplating retirement, a man who had seen too many campaigns and not enough peace. Lloyd spoke to him the way he spoke to everyone, directly, confidently, with a plan already in his pocket. The knight listened. He looked at the armored soldiers behind him. He looked at the man with the shovel, and he made a choice. The kind of choice that changes the shape of an army. A proposal for the future, hopeful, against a bloody sword on the ground. The past and the future sitting beside each other. And then, the academy, grand stone buildings under bright sunlight, a serene academic atmosphere. The kind of place that looked like knowledge and smelled like competition. Bangle sat at a desk, lecturing, with a stern expression. In warm lighting, Lloyd sat with creatures perched on him like a man who had given up on dignity and found something better. Popodong laughed. Bangle blushed. And somewhere in the halls of that institution, the schemer wrapped in noble skin was already thinking 3 moves ahead. He raised his fist, triumphant, in a dimly lit room, with plushies on his shoulder. This was victory. Strange, improbable, absolutely his kind of victory. But King Storma was laughing, bathed in fiery red light, radiating malice, a laugh that had nothing to do with joy, everything to do with plans. And somewhere in the east, the old sultan was listening to reports of monsters, a sky full of creatures, a kingdom under siege, and the desperate need for something, someone who could change the math. The meeting happened in a sunlit hall. The sultan gestured grandly. The old merchant leaned forward, grimacing, and Lloyd smiled, the warm, golden, completely untrustworthy smile of a man who has already won the negotiation. The check was large, the deal was done, and the man with the shovel walked out of the hall with more resources than he'd started with, hands in pockets, bathed in warm, hazy light, confident to survive and to thrive by reshaping the world around him with his mind and his shovel, one project at a time. That was still the vow, and it was working, for now. But Javier was troubled, standing in the bright, ethereal light with a somber expression. Something he had heard, something that did not fit into the plan. He looked up, intense light, sound effects, dramatic, and then he was walking, fast, down a bright, stone hallway, with 3 other men, urgent, determined. The city was being planned, green projections glowing in a dimly lit room. Lloyd manipulating the grid with his hands, confident, eerie green light, a grand castle in a sun-drenched valley below, peaceful, idyllic, the kind of thing worth protecting. But something was wrong. A distressed man being held back on a barren hillside, a blood stain on a stark floor, an injured man activating green energy with desperate fingers. Lloyd fell against a stone wall. His attendants panicked. He lay unconscious. Bathed in warm, dramatic light, urgent, the man with the shovel had been struck down, not by a monster, not by a knight, by something subtler. Something that had been building since before he arrived in this world. And at the palace, the grand palace under a bright, cloudy sky, soldiers readied crossbows. The queen stood in the courtyard, sword drawn, confident. A commander shouted in alarm. Spears rained down. She deflected them, purple energy blazing from her sword, a powerful blast erupting from her hands. The soldiers recoiled. She held her ground. She always held her ground, and in the grand hall, red banners, sunlight awe, a young noble tore a scroll. Determination in every fiber of the motion. Dramatic light. Something had been decided, something that could not be undecided. The queen stared intently, brow furrowed, warm, dramatic lighting, and a sly man with glowing eyes watched a young man writing. Ominous, grand. The kind of watching that is also a kind of hunting. The man with the shovel had read the ending. He had seen the burning villages, the red sky, the despair. He had pressed yes and watched it all unfold, and now he was writing something, in a grand hall, under red banners. A different ending, because that was the vow. That had always been the vow, to survive, to thrive, to reshape the world around him with his mind and his shovel, one project at a time. And somewhere in the halls of the palace, someone was waiting for him to finish writing, watching with glowing eyes, already calculating. The game had shown him the ending, but the game had not accounted for him, had not accounted for a man who had read too many engineering textbooks and not enough warnings, a man who looked at a fixed ending and said, no. A man who built bridges in worlds that had never heard of suspension cables, who redirected stampedes with flags, who befriended giant beavers, who knelt on red carpets and presented scrolls to queens and smiled the smile of someone who has already won. The story was not over. It had barely begun. And the man with the shovel, the schemer wrapped in noble skin, the developer in a world of swords, the boy who fell into the wrong story and decided to rewrite it, was still standing, still smiling, still planning. One project at a time,